Hello and welcome to Tom Talks. Now today we're going to go through the all new Formula 1 2022 aerodynamics regulations. Now last year, in about October, we had the wind tunnel model which actually got released, and around that time we also had issue 2 of the regulations. Now way back then I actually prepared a regulation model. Never really got around to finishing off the actual model though. So based off those regulations, which are now quite out of date, I think we're on to issue 6 or something now, I actually created the model. So although we're not perfectly with the exact new regulations, we can get a general understanding for the flow field. Now in this video we're going to concentrate purely on the front interactions, because there's a lot of interactions in this car. So this is going to be the front wing, the front wheel, the front suspension, and all the little deflectors around the wheel. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so firstly, some of the boring stuff out of the way. Very briefly, my simulation setup was around about 25 million elements polyhedral. I maxed out 128 gigabytes of RAM. Doing it, I used K-Omega SST as my turbulence model, and I had multiple refinement regions around the car in regions of high velocity gradients, so places like front Tyre Square, the underfloor where the fences are, and the rear tyre, as well as some other sections where I refined to less detail. So that's quite important, and I will reiterate again, this is issue 2 of the regulations, and I've probably missed something still, but the whole purpose of the simulations is to get just a real general understanding of what the cars are going to be like, and roughly potentially some direction as to what the teams are going to do. So without further ado, let's get into it. So as mentioned before, we're going to focus on the front wing here, and the front sort of assembly. So we've got the nose, we've got the front wing and the front wheel itself. Now the front wing has two jobs really, or the front wing and front nose. We need to produce our downforce quota, which I can tell you right now is very quite easy, I think. We're dealing with a rear end limited vehicle here, whether that be rear end downforce or rear end drag at some of the high speed places. Generating enough downforce for balance on the front I don't think is going to be an issue at all. The other role that we need to do is manage the flow to the rest of the car, and this is much more important, and where things begin to get a bit trickier, because this front wing is different to what we've had before. So let's have a bit more of a look. Now briefly with the regulations, you get 4 elements to play with, so you can have up to 4. You're not going to be dealing with crazy angles of attack, so it's not going to be the be all end all. It's usually the thing that journalists like to pick up on. This car has 3, this car has 4, but typically there are much bigger things that they miss. One thing with the elements is they have to be continuous. So there's a rule that states that any normal of the elements, so that'll be a normal there, normal there, normal there, has to be within 20 degrees of the vertical axis, which basically means that you can't have an element discontinue. So we couldn't create a Y250 like structure and chop those 2 elements down there, because there'd be an angle around there which would not be legal at all. So we have to keep that in mind. But the first thing to consider really is your downforce. So you need to produce some sort of level of downforce. What sort of a distribution do you want? And you can immediately see here you lose quite a lot of efficiency in this outboard section, which is what we'd expect, because we don't have any sort of footplate here to stop flow coming under with a nice vortex structure there. And this is, I mean, aerodynamically compared to what we're used to, this is absolutely horrible. It's terrible, and so managing the flow around here is going to be quite important. Now in terms of downforce production, I like to think of it, we've got a middle section here, we've got a central section there, we've got a mid part here and an outboard part here. So central, middle and outboard. How are you going to generate your low pressure across these 3 sections? And I think what's going to be quite common to see is what we saw in a lot of the renders and in the wind tunnel model, and a lot in 2021 apart from the Red Bull, which is to really drop the angle of attack off on your outboard section. This is especially true because unlike 2021, we don't have a footplate to generate some loss or a vortex. It's all very, very clean air, so ramping up that outboard section isn't really going to be doing you too much good. And the reason for this is because if you go and ramp up the outboard section, you're going to suck in all the air inboard like this. You can see the crazy negative coefficient of pressure on the wheel there. That's all of the inwash, which is going to give you squirt, and this is, I think, one of the biggest sections of the car that you need to manage. Admittedly, when I first saw the design, I thought this is the area of the car that you gain the performance from. You need to manage this squirt across all different conditions of steer. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. So generally, I'd say drop off the outboard section of the front wing. It seems the most logical thing to do. Now, we're very, very used to producing a lot of downforce in this middle section of our front wing. And you always have to remember what's the reason for this, and 9 times out of 10 it's regulations. So before 2009, with the old regulations, we had very low central sections quite close to the ground, and in these sections we actually had 2 elements generated quite a bit of downforce and then downwashed into the floor after. There's benefits to generating downforce in the central section of the car, and also disadvantages. Firstly, let's say that we need to produce 10 downforces on the front wing. If we produce more on our inboard section here, and our outboard section is remaining constant, then we can produce less downforce in our central section. And the reason it might be desirable to produce less downforce in your central section is because what you're effectively going to do is trim up this coefficient of pressure region and suck even less air inboard that way. So you're going to have, in fact, even a bit more lateral, which is going to help with your Tyre Square management. So I generally like the concept of generating quite a lot of load on this inboard section. And what you'll actually see is that in front of the nose there, I have actually got a gap. Now this is done quite poorly by me. However, with the nose, your regulations are that you need to cover a reference surface. So you can't just have no nose, otherwise teams probably would. It has to all be one section. I think generally, if you're going to follow this concept and actually have elements underneath the nose, or an element underneath the nose feeding into the nose to generate the central downforce, I think what you do is pull the nose as far back as you possibly can and lift it all the way up. And then with your front wing, you'll push the first element or first 2 elements as far forward and as low down as you can go, so that you've got the maximum volume going to your underfloor and the maximum downforce sort of producing levels under your central section of wing if you're following this concept. There's down sides to this concept, which is you have to, if you're upwashing the flow, you're going to have to downwash it back into the underfloor. You're going to generate some lift by the curvature of the underside of the nose to do this. So I'm very interested to see if teams will do this. If I had to take a stab in the dark based on these regulations, yeah, I think that people would have at least one element in front of the nose, but big stab in the dark. Now, what else do we have? Well, the wing can't be as low to the ground as it wants to be, of course. We have to stay in our volume box, and in this case I've actually put the wing as low as it can go. I think that this is fairly likely. If there's a section that's going to be raised up, it'll probably be the central section, but I think it's going to be as low as it can go if I have a guess at it. I think the outboard section will definitely be as low as it can go to minimize some of the inwash that you have in that area, because you create a smaller gap between the wing and the ground. Admittedly, you do decrease your coefficient of pressure in that area because you're increasing ground effect, which will suck more in, but I think on balance, bringing the front wing outboard section lower is generally a good idea. The teams do have slot gap separators which they're allowed to put in. They've also got brackets to adjust flaps and also to hold the elements while you adjust them for angle. And you do also have tire temp sensors. The teams usually play some sorts of games with these. You could potentially generate a small amount of loss in front of that front tire because we're really shooting out straight into it right now. But generally I think that's sort of the downforce production concept. Now there's more things to consider. So we're probably going to be, let's have a look at the dive plane. So on this outboard section here, this is just behind the wing. And here we produce two structures. These are the two main structures of the car. So you have your tip end plate vortex and you have your dive plane vortex. In a way, the dive plane is helping encourage this tip one, as well as the fact that you've got a higher pressure on the inside than you do on the outside. Now, I think that you're going to want to put this dive plane lower, as low as you're allowed to go with the rules. There's a few reasons for this. Well, firstly, you will sacrifice this vortex a little bit by moving it lower because you won't have that interaction. But the lower you can go, the less air is going to want to come in and underneath that front wing. So I think that it's very likely that we'll see that. The rules actually specify from side view, if here's the front and there's the rear must be 75 millimeters higher than the front. Now the obvious loop around this and still get expansion is to give quite a large leading edge, but you need to be within 6 millimeters of your virtual surface which you define. So you define a surface, which means that it's going to have to be some sort of a thin element with a 10 mil minimum for damage to other cars. So not to reduce damage to other cars. So you can't have a perfectly sharp shading edge, but I think what you're likely going to do is bow up your leading edge a little bit, go for maximum thickness, so I think 12 millimeters, downwash it as much as you dare, so then you have the maximum amount of expansion later on. And I think you'll probably try to target some of the low pressure underneath the dive plane to stop the air wanting to come under the wing as much as it does. All about that tire squirt management. Now you also, with the end plate itself, have 10 degrees to play with. So you could curve it out or you could curve it in 10 degrees. You can also, from vertical view, up the top, you can curve it out 10 degrees or curve it in 10 degrees. Now this is going to be a much smaller effect, I think, than what most people think. If I was to have a stab at it, I like the idea of pulling the end plate inboard. If you pull the end plate inboard, actually not curving, like curving it in vertically, I like this because you get more area for your dive plane, which could help you out. I should note that you can curve your dive plane around a little bit as well to perhaps have it starting low but affect your vortex production by curving it up at the end. So I like the idea of curving it in. In terms of the outwash, low down to the ground, as is with this top picture, you have quite a lot of inwash. So it's more likely that if you're trying to retain clean flow that you'd have quite a straight end plate, but I wouldn't be surprised if you outwash it because you have found a way to outwash your wing a little bit more, or to actually generate some loss into the front tire. Up higher, the vortex is always going to pass outboard of the front wheel. That is, this vortex, you're always going to pass outside the front of the front wheel in old conditions, I think. Outwashing here is going to slightly counteract that vortex production because it's going to want to spin it the other way because of the curvature of the end plate. So yeah, I think that these are relatively small gains, but I don't know, we'll probably see some sort of outwash going on there, but I think that these are quite quite small gains again. Now, when we look from side view, you can begin to see some of the low pressure that's being accelerated around this leading edge and also under the canard or the dive plane. And this is what I was talking about before. If you put lots of low pressure here, then you could potentially stop the roll up underneath there. And this would be very useful if you put that much lower to the ground. Now, I can also probably draw it out here. If you bring your leading edge up, then you can still have your 75 mil to the back. You're just going to want to balloon out that leading edge as much as you possibly can, which is not a lot with the regulations, but it's what we could work with. Another thing that you could potentially look at is the back portion of that end plate, maybe some sort of a cutout or very rules dependent, something cutting out this outboard section, because probably up higher it's almost more of an obstruction, but it's very dependent on how much outwash we are getting up high. The thing to remember is we are getting in quite close proximity to the tyre, and the air is either going to want to go around the left side, right side, or directly over the top. Now, if it's going to go push to one side, it's going to get pushed to one side, so the air can naturally be outwashing and the end plate can actually hold it from outwashing. So if 10 degrees isn't enough on end plate angle, you could go for a cutout, potentially, as long as rules compliance is okay. Now, first thing to note here is my suspension. These bottom two elements are actually illegal. I'm not sure how that happened. I set them all to the same angle, but anyway, they can only be 10 degrees nose down or flat. And this is to stop excessive downwashing, which is very important. It's kind of what we'd like to do. You can see the wake of the front wing being taken and then downwashed here. And this means that we can put it into the undercut and flow it out to the floor edge, where we'll likely have another profile to generate some load. Also, make sure that we don't separate off the leading edge of our floor, which would be absolutely disastrous. So on the tracks where we're doing quite aggressive wing angles, we're going to be trying to downwash this air into the under tray there. Now, the wing itself, in different sections, so you notice this is a very outboard portion, that's more like the middle portion, and then we'll have an inboard portion which is even more backed off. You're going to sculpt your suspension and have different profiles to match the upwash in that region. So you might have part of the suspension which is flat and then other parts which are nose down. And nose down will also gain you, flatter A-arms will also gain you advantages on your effective angle of attack going into your rear wing, so generate some more load there at the cost of front balance. Okay, now you could potentially also sculpt your nose, because the nose itself starts quite low, obviously, and then it needs to taper off, so you're always going to be generating lift no matter what you do on the top section of your nose itself, provided it's on one smooth curve. And I think that maybe you could mess around with where the nose changes angle, if it's just all one smooth section, or if you do have quite a kink there, maybe you align the kink with the suspension. Hard to say, but I don't know, maybe there's some small gains there by trying to pull some air around the driver, but the rules are quite restrictive with curvatures and an external sort of shape of the nose itself. So maybe there's some gains there. Well, I suppose we'll have to see. Another thing to note is that I'm missing the camera. So there's actually a camera which would sit, I think, around here. I'm missing that on the very inboard section of wing, but that'll only be adding a little bit of downwash. Okay, so the tyre also has the device here, and this has changed quite a lot since the initial wind tunnel model. The new device is much shorter, so mine actually goes across the whole wheel pretty much. The new one has a larger cord, is a shorter span, but also multi-element. So we can't really analyze the flow too much in that region, but I mean, you hear different things from everyone, but these are trying to downwash the air. So you can keep it attached to the tyre for longer, and the weight behind the tyre is generally smaller, so it's easier to work the devices downstream without having to go for crazy outwash to really carry the weight outboard, which is bad for following cars. Now you can also see, I mean, firstly the front wings creating quite a bit of loss here, and in this portion here, it's honestly down to front wing element selection, probably slot gaps and modeling a boundary layer. What you could potentially look at is, I mean, ideally you can see our loss gets downwashed in front of the tyre, as we'd expect. Now, I like the idea of putting controlled loss here. You could, I don't know, maybe look at blunting out a trailing edge or something. Although even on small scale, your von Karman vortex is incredibly transient, so stability and front end stability could be a bit iffy, but if you could get some form of loss in front of the tyre, it'd be really quite ideal. And it's quite hard because the rules specially prescribe that the front wing tip, where we have the 3 or 4 elements joining onto the end plate, must be smooth, and that's really the target of the rules itself, to make that connection incredibly smooth. So I'll play you quickly through. I've been talking about this Tyre Square and managing the squirt and how important the squirt is for the package. I'll show you what it actually looks like. So we have our 2 structures just past the front wing there. You can see we've kicked up a bit of loss around the chassis there, so you ideally have a bigger radius there, or bring your angle of attack right the way down. This whole section here is just generally designed poorly by myself. There's some gains there. Okay, let's move on. So you can instantly see how the trailing edge weight comes inboard. Whoop. So here, and then you can see inboard. Here, inboard. So our 2 structures do pass outboard, but the weight comes inboard. We're getting crazy amounts of inwash in the front tyre, which is definitely not really what we're used to with Formula 1. I mean, if you could put a strake there, or 2 strakes, and generate some downwash for some tyre squirt management, that'd be ideal, but new regulations, and this is the way they are. And that is what our squirt looks like. So I'll come back a bit. You can see our inwash, we have a lot of high energy air coming into the small gap between the contact patch and the edge of the tyre, and that squirts out. The squirt modelling should be easier this year because there's less deflection in the tyre because we've got bigger wheels. So it should be easier to model the squirt, but it's going to be quite a significant impact on performance, I think, because it directly affects how large the inlet to your underfloor can be. And then we'll go down to the last right there. So I'll go back to the start for you. Start here, loss of inwash, squirt, and you can see how that squirt actually moves inboard quite a bit there. So here, inboard, here, inboard. You can also see how much upwash you generate in the central section of your suspension. This is why I was saying that you might want to sculpt those elements themselves. Okay, now we've also got to finish off these leaked photos. So you can begin to see how much shorter these deflectors are. So that's why I've not concentrated too much on that region itself. But the real thing that we can see perfectly from this photo is, so we've also got these add-ons here, these little squirt capturers, which weren't in the original wind tunnel model or models. These would definitely increase your performance. You can see with what the leading edge is tangent to, and that is the inwash of flow. So exactly as the CFD shows, you're getting a lot of flow which wants to come inboard, and that's what they're kind of trying to do here. The tricky part with this device is that it has a lot of sensitivities in steer. The wheels steer quite a lot, and so it's quite easy to separate the leading edge and actually make more mess than what you'd gain with these devices, especially when they're so thin. And we can see that there is gains in this region because of what's going on with the outboard fence in the floor. Now, I'm not going to concentrate on this too much. You can see the outboard fence of the floor. If I perhaps go blue, outboard fence of the floor, it actually goes down like that. This is directly sculpted to what the CPT looks like in this region. So up high, we can have a very wide inlet because we've got a lot of happy air. This is saying that up higher, our wake management is much better. We've got that multi-element device over the wheel, and we're not sucking air underneath the wing. Instead, we've got a higher pressure region on top of the wing and a lower pressure outside. Very good wake management up high. Down low though, it is much, much smaller of a region, so they're not quite getting all of the air in here that they would like. You would ideally have that directly down and have everything as open as the regulations allow you to absolutely maximize mass flow in this region. So I think the general takeaway with the front wing is, yes, you need to produce your quota downforce, which is going to be very easily. I'm interested to see if teams run an element in front of the nose and pull the nose back to increase mass flow to the floor, and also how they manage the outboard section of front wing, how low the angle of attack there actually is to really catch the squirt or prevent the squirt coming out as much as it does, and therefore open up the inlet to their floor, which is something that hopefully we'll visibly be able to see a bit better, and maybe that'll be a performance differentiator. Alright, so thank you for watching this video. I think I jumped around a fair bit there, but I think that we got a general understanding of the flow field around the front wing, front wheel and front suspension. This is of course only one part of the car, and the whole car needs to interact, but it's definitely much better. I think that I split these up into shorter videos. I look forward to talking about the middle of the car. See you then.